you are at History Café now that we're done with all the Zoom instructions. And History Café is a partnership between MOHAI and HistoryLink. So we are so glad to be able to do this and to be able to continue this. I think we're going on what, 9 or 10 years. So it's special to be able to continue this even in our new online format. Before I turn it over to Jennifer, who will be telling you more about the program tonight, I first want to take a moment to acknowledge that wherever you're zooming in from, and I see that we've got some people from out of state, wherever you're zooming in from, you are on Indigenous land. Here at MOHAI, well, pretending in MOHAI, but also where I am too, in the U District of Seattle, I'm on the land of the Duwamish, Suquamish, and Coast Salish people. And it's really important to acknowledge the forced displacement of Native communities from this land, while also honoring the endurance of the Duwamish people who still live here. To this day, the Duwamish people have yet to receive federal recognition. And we encourage you to learn more by visiting the Duwamish Longhouse and Cultural Center in West Seattle when that's open, and for now, visiting them digitally on their website. And we'll put the links to that in the chat. If you're from a different area than Seattle, really encourage you to learn more about the Indigenous communities near you. And we'll put another link in the chat for you to explore that as well. In addition, I want to note that this program is taking place during an era of unprecedented protests against police violence towards Black people. And police violence in general. There was another officer involved shooting that just happened. So these protests in our community and across the nation are a call to action for each of us to state unequivocally that Black lives matter, and that MOHAI stands unfalteringly with those who are calling for justice now. And these themes are ones that we'll continue to be exploring throughout our programming and continue to hope that you hold as you take in the content tonight. Thank you. And with that, I am so happy to introduce our wonderful partner, Jennifer Ott from HistoryLink, to tell us more about the knowledge that's going to be shared with us tonight. So I'm going to get out of the way and let this show get going.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for the lovely welcome and introduction. I am also very excited to be here this evening. I am just fascinated by the history of Hanford, and our two speakers tonight are going to be very interesting, I have no doubt. So I'm going to have them join us now, and I will give a short introduction before they begin. One of our speakers is Michael Mays. He is the former Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, and he is currently a professor of English and director of the Hanford History Project at Washington State University, Tri-Cities. He is a native Washingtonian, but he spent 19 years as a professor and department chair of English at the University of Southern Mississippi, which I am sure there is a whole nother program's worth of interesting stories related to that. In addition to numerous articles on Irish history and culture, he is the author or co-author of 3 books, World War I and the Cultures of Modernity, Nation States, the Cultures of Irish Nationalism, and Global Crossroads, a World Literature Reader. His most recent book, Legacies of the Manhattan Project, Reflection on 75 Years of a Nuclear World, was published as Volume 2 in Wazoo's Hanford History book series. And it just came out in August, and you'll be seeing a cover of that during the presentation if you would like to check that out. I encourage you, it sounds fascinating. Our second speaker is Steve Olson. He is the author of the recent book, The Apocalypse Factory, Plutonium and the Making of the Atomic Age, which is a history of the Hanford Nuclear Reservation in South Central Washington State, which we have a few people from there so that you're all familiar, but he'll have a map also so that everyone is well situated. And then his most recent book prior to this was Eruption, The Untold Story of Mount St. Helens, which won the Washington State Book Award in 2017. Very deservedly, I have to say, I enjoyed that book thoroughly. And since 1979, he has been a consultant writer for the National Academy of Sciences, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, and other national scientific organizations. He's a 4th generation Washingtonian and lives in Seattle. So welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for being here. And I will step out of the way and let you take the screen.
Okay, Well, thank you, Jennifer and Rachel. It's a great pleasure to be here with you all this evening, and especially to have the opportunity to share the stage with one of our state's most eminent historians, Steve Olson. In keeping with Rachel's spirit of describing ourselves, I'm in my home office here. I'm wearing a blue shirt. I have quite a bit less hair than Steve does. On the screen is the Hanford History Project logo, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what the Hanford History Project is as we get started here tonight. So it's a logo with a prominent emphasis on Hanford, and I think that's about it for that. So the Hanford History Project at Washington State University Tri-Cities was established in 2014 to collect, preserve, and interpret the history of Hanford, the Tri-Cities, and the greater Mid-Columbia region. We fulfill these objectives in a variety of ways, some of which include housing and managing the Department of Energy's Hanford collection, which comprises approximately 3,000 Hanford Site artifacts, as well as archival materials dating from 1943 to 1990. We maintain our own collection of community artifacts and archival and photographic collections. We have a very robust oral history program. We're always interested to know what's your Hanford story, and if you have a Hanford story, we'd love to talk to you. We support scholarly research and academic publications through our partnership with WSU Press on its Hanford History book series, through our recently established Washington Wine History Initiative, and through educational outreach activities, curricular development, and in partnerships and collaborations with like-minded local, regional, and national organizations. The Hanford History Project's mission is to both facilitate and promote scholarly research across a broad range of disciplines, and to support and encourage public history through a range of community activities and events, including lectures, seminars, conferences, workshops, and lifelong learning opportunities. If we could go to the next slide, please. This slide is a picture of Nowhere to Remember, Volume 1 in the Hanford History Series. It's got a blue cover and with a picture of the old Hanford High School, which is one of the few remaining buildings on the Hanford site. In supporting both academic research and public history, we aspire to document the diverse historical influences that have shaped our region, beginning with the Ice Age floods and continuing through the migration stories of its indigenous Native American and pioneering European settler communities, Hanford's role in the Manhattan Project and Cold War, and up to its ongoing role in delivering cutting-edge science and engineering in the areas of waste remediation and environmental sciences. As a public-facing academic unit at Washington State University, we are uniquely positioned to partner with and add value to many different community groups, government agencies, other academic and research institutions, and others who share our interest in documenting and advancing knowledge of the extraordinary scientific, cultural, and political achievements at Hanford. In particular, we work closely with the Department of Energy, the National Park Service, and the Tri-Cities National Park Committee to support their respective missions with regard to the Hanford unit of the recently created Manhattan Project National Historical Park. We recently completed a 2-year collaboration with the Pacific West Regional Office of the National Park Service and the Tri-Cities African American Community Cultural and Educational Society, or ACCESS, on a project titled Documenting African American Migration, Segregation, and Civil Rights History at Manhattan Project National Historical Park, Hanford. In 2017, we hosted an international conference, Legacies of the Manhattan Project, Reflections on 75 Years of a Nuclear World, with more than 100 participants from 7 different countries. Additionally, WSU's location on the edge of the Hanford site in the Tri-Cities Research District presents opportunities to regularly engage with and support the work of, for example, the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory, or LIGO, DOE, NPS, Port of Benton, Richland and Mid-Columbia Libraries, and as Jennifer was mentioning before, the Reach Museum and Interpretive Center. We are regularly on the lookout to partner with other local, regional, or national organizations, such as HistoryLink.org and MOHAI, whenever we have an opportunity and share mutual interests. So with that, I will turn it over to Steve.
Great, thanks, Mike. I'm going to talk a bit about why Hanford was built, where and when it was. Really one of the most amazing stories of the 21st century. But, you know, I grew up, actually, I live in Seattle now, but I grew up in Othello, just 15 miles away from the nearest reactor at Hanford. And this was a story that I didn't even know when I began writing this book. And I'm amazed that so few people do know all the details of this story. So it began in the year 1941 with this man, Glenn Seaborg, who was doing fundamental research on some of the heaviest elements found in nature, including uranium. He's a scientist. He's shown here at the controls of a radiation detector in his laboratory at the University of California, Berkeley, where in the year 1941, he was a 29-year-old lecturer in the chemistry department. So what he and his colleagues discovered is that if you bombard the most common form of uranium, which is known as uranium-238, with a subatomic particle known as a neutron, you can create an element that doesn't exist in nature. So on this next slide, I'm going to show you some of the details of how this process works. You don't really need to understand all the details, but I just thought that it might be nice to know the gist of it, because that's why Hanford is there. When a neutron hits an element, hits an atom of uranium-238, the result is a radioactive isotope of uranium known as uranium-239, and as shown on this diagram that's here. Now, when an element is radioactive, that means that it's eventually going to change into a different kind of atom. But how and when an atom changes depends on what kind of atom it is. So it turns out that uranium-239 changes over the course of actually just a few hours into an atom that's known as neptunium-239. But neptunium-239 is also radioactive, and it changes over the course of a couple of days into an element that had never been observed before, which Seaborg and his colleagues named plutonium. Plutonium-239 is called in this diagram. And the reason they chose the word plutonium is because they were following the planets, right? So you have Uranus, you have Neptune, and Pluto is the next planet. So that's why it's called plutonium. Now, plutonium-239 is also a radioactive element, but it's much more stable than either uranium-239 or neptunium-239. Once you've created plutonium-239, it remains more or less unchanged for thousands of years. So once you've made it, it's going to be around for a long time. So as I said, Glenn Seaborg was a scientist doing fundamental research on the basic constituents of matter. But even by the time that he and a couple of his colleagues had made this discovery, their research had already been classified top secret. And the reason was that Seaborg and his colleagues suspected, even before they made it, that plutonium-239 could be used to make atomic bombs. In fact, not only could plutonium-239 be used to make atomic bombs, but it was the best. It turned out they discovered just a couple of weeks after they discovered the element that it was the best material in the universe to make atomic bombs. Pound for pound, plutonium can produce a larger explosion than any other element. That's actually why we continue to use plutonium in our nuclear weapons today. So with this discovery, scientists knew that the first country that could produce enough plutonium for an atomic bomb would be in a possession of a weapon that could change the world. But here was the problem in 1941. How could you produce enough plutonium to make an atomic bomb? So remember, to make plutonium, you need two things. You need uranium atoms, but you can just dig that out of the ground. And lots of uranium was available in 1941. But the second thing you needed was neutrons. And these were a lot harder to get. To do their experiments at the University of California, this slide shows the cyclotron that Seaborg used in the year 1941 to produce neutrons that he used in his experiment. But even with this large and complicated piece of equipment, Seaborg had been able to make an extremely small number of plutonium atoms, not even enough to see in a microscope. He would detect them using things like that radiation detector that was shown in that first slide. So if there was going to make enough plutonium for an atomic bomb, they were going to need orders of magnitude more neutrons. And in the year 1941, when Seaborg made this discovery, nobody knew how to do that. Nobody knew where you could get enough neutrons to make an atomic bomb. So the history of atomic bombs has many amazing coincidences, but this is one of the most astonishing ones that I've ever heard of. At the very same time that Seaborg was doing his experiments in California, the physicist Enrico Fermi, who was then working at Columbia University in New York City, was thinking how to build nuclear reactors. And on the next slide shows a photograph of Enrico Fermi, famous photograph of him, one of the most famous physicists of the 21st century, standing in front of a blackboard. Like Seaborg, Fermi was a scientist who was doing basic research into the fundamental constituents of nature. And as part of that research, he was working on a device that would come to be known as a nuclear reactor. Nuclear reactors split uranium atoms, and in that process, they produce immense amounts of energy. That's why we use nuclear reactors today to generate electrical power. But nuclear reactors also generate something else. They make fantastic quantities of neutrons, far more neutrons than had ever been available before. So when Seaborg discovered plutonium in 1941, Fermi, Seaborg, and other scientists actually all over the world just put two and two together. If Fermi could get a nuclear reactor to work, he could produce more than enough neutrons to make plutonium for an atomic bomb. In fact, that's why Fermi built the world's first nuclear reactor under the stands of an abandoned football field at the University of Chicago in 1942, the year after Seaborg discovered plutonium. This next slide shows a painting of that very first relatively small scale nuclear reactor. It was so top secret at the time because it was part of the Manhattan Project that no photograph was ever taken of the world's first nuclear reactor, and therefore this painting was made after the fact, recreating the scene. So it's true that Fermi wanted to know if a nuclear reactor was going to work, and that was one of the reasons why he built this reactor under the stands of Stagg Field. But the even more important reason was he wanted to determine if a nuclear reactor would work, if it could then generate enough neutrons to be able to create plutonium in the much larger reactors that even then, elsewhere at the University of Chicago, were being designed. So less than 3 weeks after the momentous date when Fermi first got this nuclear reactor to work, a colonel in the US Army Corps of Engineers named Franklin Matthias was flying in a small plane over south central Washington state. And the next slide has a map of the area around what is today the Tri-Cities. Matthias's job was to find a place where the federal government could build nuclear reactors that were large enough to manufacture the plutonium that was needed for atomic bombs. And as soon as he flew over the Horse Heaven Hills, just south of the city, the current day city of Richland, he realized that this area stretching from Richland along the Columbia River up to the small farming town of White Bluffs would be absolutely perfect. The Columbia River could provide plenty of cold water that would be needed to cool the nuclear reactors. Grand Coulee Dam had just come online the year before, and there was actually some power lines that ran directly through this site, so they could provide electricity for all the facilities that would be needed at the site. The Milwaukee Road had a spur line that came down the Columbia River and went to the town of White Bluffs. Mike has written about this in some of his books. And the company that built Hanford, the DuPont company, knew that they could use that rail line to bring equipment and chemicals into the site. And it was far enough away from any large population centers that they knew that if anything went wrong with the reactors, not too terribly many people would be killed. At that time, the towns of Richland, Hanford, and White Bluffs each had about 250 people living in them. There might have been 1,500 people altogether scattered in this area that would become the site of the Hanford Nuclear Reservation. So Fritz Matthias flying in his plane over this area on the very first day of winter in 1942, realized it would not be a difficult task to move them out of the way and build the facilities there. So Mike, now you were going to tell us a bit about how those reactors and other facilities got built.
Get my microphone back on here. Yes, thank you, Steve. So this slide that you're looking at is a slide depicting the construction at Hanford Construction Camp. So the construction of the massive and challenging Hanford Engineer Works commenced in March 1943. The challenges were exacerbated by the remote location, as you've just seen on the map that Steve showed, and the fact that so many men and women were already engaged in the war effort at home and abroad. DuPont advertised for workers in newspapers for an unspecified, quote unquote, war construction project in southeastern Washington, offering attractive scale of wages and living facilities. Before the government evictions, about 1,500 to 2,000 people lived along the 30-mile stretch of the Columbia River, including at Hanford and White Bluffs. But by June of 1944, when employment levels peaked, the construction camp at Hanford was home to 51,000 people from 47 states, the majority of them past draft age, but still young enough to help build the huge industrial complex. So if we could go to the next slide. And we see here, as the slide says, the Hanford Construction Camp, the trailer section. And you can see all of those trailers there where people who were building both the camp itself and the facilities, the industrial facilities, lived. Construction on both the camp itself and the nuclear facilities proceeded at breakneck speed. In just 18 months between March 1943 and September 1944, both the camp and B reactor were built. It took just a little over 9 months from the time the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers broke ground on B reactor in October 1943 until the reactor went critical on September 26, 1944. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Here we see men building forms for concrete, working on B reactor. The camp, deemed the world's largest trailer park, would eventually be home to 131 men's barracks, 64 women's barracks, 8 mess halls, separate beer halls for men and women, an auditorium, a movie theater, butcher shop, grocery store, Sears outlet, hospital, post office, and a bus system more extensive than that of the city of Chicago. Next slide, please. Here we see one of the trailers, prettified, I might say, with a white picket fence around it. By the end of the war in August 1945, Hanford's construction forces would build 554 buildings, 386 miles of road, 158 miles of railroad, 3 massive chemical plants, and the world's first 3 production scale nuclear reactors. Remarkably, most of those who worked on the site had no idea what they were building. And you'll hear a little bit more about this culture of secrecy from Steve shortly. They only knew that what they were doing had been deemed essential for the frantic effort to win the war. Despite the secrecy shrouding the enterprise and the draconian security measures put in place to keep that secrecy intact, most workers, or those who stayed anyway, and many didn't, felt intense pride in the part they were playing in the nation's war effort. Hanford workers sought to support the troops, not only through their labor, but in other ways as well. And if we could go to the next slide. This is a picture of day's pay, a B-17 bomber that was paid for, as I'll mention here, with funds from Hanford workers. And there's a group of people standing just underneath the nose of the plane. The same patriotic spirit that inspired the swift construction of the site and its facilities gave rise to another remarkable effort, a worker-driven campaign to, quote, give a day's pay and send a bomber on its way. Carpenter Max Blanchard is generally credited with coming up with the idea for buying a warplane to send overseas. Shortly after the D-Day landing of June 6, 1944, Blanchard received a letter from his son, who was fighting there. The letter was full of praise for the offensive support the troops received from the air. Blanchard knew then that a plane was the right gift for the Army and that it would be appreciated more than anything else. Blanchard told his crew about his idea and they quickly spread the word. Next slide, please. This is a picture of a woman christening Day's Pay. Soon, the whole Hanford site was enthusiastically supporting the idea of buying the war machine. Over the course of the next month, the payroll department collected a day's pay from each of some 51,000 employees. If we could go to the next slide. And this one is of a pilot and a soldier standing in front of Day's Pay. The Give a Bomber committee held a contest to pick a name for the plane. 11 people submitted the name Day's Pay since the campaign was conducted under the slogan, "Give a day's pay and send a bomber on its way." All employees who contributed to the cause received a certificate acknowledging their share of the bomber. Okay, next slide, please. On July 23rd, 1944, the $300,000 B-17 paid for by Hanford workers was christened at the site. So patriotism unites. It brings us together to achieve great things. But as we've come to know all too well, patriotism harbors a dark side as well, fear. And fear, especially after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, fear was ascendant as the United States was drawn into the Second World War. And if we could go to the next slide, please. This is a cover of Volume 3 in the Hanford Histories series. The book is Echoes of Exclusion and Resistance, Voices from the Hanford Region. It's got an orange cover and it shows African Americans protesting against racism in Pasco or in Kennewick. I'll talk just briefly about one example very close to home for those of us here in the Tri-Cities, the Yamuchi family from Pasco. This is a story recounted by my colleague, WSU history professor Robert Bauman, in the Hanford History Project's recently released third volume, which you see a picture of the cover here. As Bauman tells the story, the Yamuchi family, Harry, wife Chica, and oldest daughter Lou, settled in Pasco in 1907, where for nearly 4 decades, the Yamuchis and their 9 children were viewed as exemplary American citizens and business people. Next slide, please. This is a picture of the internment orders notifying persons of Japanese ancestry about where to report. And it's dated April 1st, 1942. World War II changed things. Following Roosevelt's Executive Order 9006, which ordered the removal of all people of Japanese descent in February 1942, members of the Yamuchi family were among the 120,000 Japanese Americans imprisoned during the war. The boundary line for the evacuation of Japanese Americans in eastern Washington was the Columbia River. People on the Benton County side of the river were ordered to internment camps, while those on the Franklin County side were supposed to be able to stay. Harry and Chica, despite residing in Franklin County, were sent to an internment camp in Arkansas because they were Japanese nationals and he was a prominent businessman. Their son Charles was not interned because he was an American citizen and lived in Franklin County. Daughter Chiyoko Yamuchi Minatoya and her husband and daughters were sent to the internment camp at Hart Mountain, Wyoming, while son George Yamuchi, a student at the University of Washington, and his wife Maddie were sent to Minidoka in Idaho. This is George, would eventually gain his release by enlisting in the U.S. Army, where he served in the 442nd Combat Unit in Italy. As a result of George's enlistment, his wife, Maddie, was allowed to return to Pasco. Next slide, please. And this is a picture of Harry and Chica Yamuchi with 4 of their children in one of Harry's businesses. Home on furlough from the Army in December 1943, George Yamuchi wrote a letter to the editor of the local newspaper asking, quote, "What does it mean to be an American? Is he white, black, yellow, red, or any other certain color?" he continued. "It is generally conceded that he is any one of these or a mixture of them all. That is one of the principles of our Constitution, is it not?" Poignant and timely questions still. As Bauman concludes, to Yamauchi, being an American citizen meant, in part, fighting for his country and exercising his freedom of speech and using the freedom of the press at a time when he and other family members had experienced hatred, imprisonment, and bigotry. His poignant plea, "What is an American?" and his answer demonstrate ways non-whites in Pasco and the Tri-Cities challenged racial prejudice. His eloquent words and heartfelt message remain just as relevant and important in the 21st century when migrant children are held in prison camps and racial discrimination and violence remain central to the experience of non-whites as they were in 1943. And I'll just add in concluding here that Voices of Exclusion is hot off the presses. It's only been out for 3 or 4 weeks. And there are many, many fascinating stories of African Americans' experiences in the Tri-Cities, of the Yamauchis, and of other Native American experiences in the Tri-Cities in and around the time of the Manhattan Project and since. So I highly recommend the book to you if you're interested in these questions, these stories, which my colleagues have done a wonderful job of unearthing. So back to you, Steve.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to talk just briefly for just a couple of minutes about the use of the plutonium manufactured at Hanford at the end of World War II. Plutonium powered the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. The Hiroshima bomb that was dropped 3 days earlier used a rare isotope of uranium that was separated from uranium ore at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. In my book, I followed the experiences of a physician at the Nagasaki Medical College Hospital named Reisuke Shirabe. This is a photograph of Dr. Shirabe sitting in his office. And I follow him in the minutes and the hours and the days after the bombing of Nagasaki. Dr. Shirabe was in his office at the hospital when the bomb exploded about a half-mile away. On the next slide, you can see a picture of the buildings of the hospital after the bomb exploded. Dr. Shirabe was extremely fortunate. This hospital had been built with reinforced concrete walls to resist the destructive power of the earthquakes that happen frequently in Japan. So when the bomb exploded, its radiation had to pass through several of these concrete walls before it reached Dr. Shirabe. But because he was only a half-mile away from the explosion, he still received a very high dose of radiation, enough to almost kill him a couple of weeks after the eruption. But he did manage to survive the radiation poisoning that he got from the bomb. In the next photograph, it shows a photograph of the valley in Nagasaki above which the bomb exploded, with the shattered hospital buildings in the foreground. The bomb exploded approximately in the center of this valley, as I say, just in the distance from where the hospital was. Dr. Shirabe's story, like those that John Hersey described in his book Hiroshima, is an absolutely horrifying story. But I wanted to include it in my book for a very specific reason. By today's standards, the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki was very small. The nuclear weapons that Russia has aimed at us today and that we have aimed at Russia contain weapons that are about 50 times as powerful as the bomb that did the incredible amount of devastation that you can see in this photograph. If a single one of a modern nuclear weapon were to explode above the city of Seattle, the death and devastation would just be completely unimaginable. And I can guarantee you that given the strategic importance of the city of Seattle, that many bombs are designated to be launched toward this city, not just the one that was so effective at destroying Nagasaki. So as I mentioned earlier, plutonium is the best material in the universe for making atomic bombs. And so when the Cold War began, and the United States and Soviet Union both began to build nuclear weapons, the demand for plutonium from the Hanford nuclear reservation expanded dramatically, as did Hanford itself. So Mike, you were going to talk a little bit about the Cold War period of Hanford's history.
Yes, great. So on the screen now is a cover of Legacies of the Manhattan Project, Volume 2 in the Hanford History Series. And I promise that these covers are not just shameless plugs for the series, but in fact are tied to the stories that I'm telling you about tonight. This one has a green cover with a faint outline of the atomic bomb, Fat Boy bomb. So we're well aware of what a remarkable scientific achievement the Manhattan Project represents. Scores of books have been written on that subject, even if we may not fully grasp all the complexities of the science itself. And even if, as Steve has reminded us earlier this evening, some parts of that story are far better remembered than others. Oppenheimer and Fermi have featured in countless histories of the period. Glenn Seaborg, as Steve notes, not so much. But nuclear science wasn't the only new discipline that emerged in the wake of the Manhattan Project. On the contrary, as the contributors to Legacies of the Manhattan Project would have us recall, the novelty of the new atomic age of necessity ushered in scores of new fields of study. Implosion physics and medical and health physics, for example, were necessary responses to unique challenges faced by the project scientists and engineers as they raced to fulfill their mission of constructing a nuclear weapon. Any number of those stories are compelling in their own right, but the one I've chosen to talk about last tonight is the one David P.D. Munns documents in his essay in the collection called "The Atom Goes to College, the Teaching Reactors That Trained the Atomic Age." As Munns contends, compared to the extensive accounts devoted to the atomic nuclear scientists, the role of the nuclear engineers in the development of the atomic bomb, first with the atomic piles, and then the vast enterprise of the nuclear industry, remains understudied and underappreciated. So if we could go to the next slide, please. And this is just a slide, stock slide, illustrating the work of a nuclear engineer. After the success of the Trinity test and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and after a Cold War turning increasingly hot, the proverbial genie of nuclear fission was out of its bottle and there would be no putting it back. What followed was a rapid rise and simultaneous expansion of a nascent nuclear industry. The question of how and whom would manage it is what Munn's essay explores. The Atomic Energy Commission, the civilian agency created by Harry Truman in 1946 to oversee the peacetime development of atomic science and technology, provided facilities and funds. What it did not provide, Munns writes, was expertise. The precipitous growth of the nuclear industry presented significant challenges. None were greater than the severe shortage of experienced nuclear operators, technicians, and engineers. Nuclear power stations were forced to recruit people from coal and oil plants with minimal training, creating the impression that nuclear power plants were, to quote Richard Rhodes, designed by geniuses and operated by idiots. Rhodes' retort indirectly highlights the essential challenge: how to go about training a workforce with the expertise to match the scope and scale of the heretofore unimagined industry. And if we could go to the last slide, please. This is a photo taken at Washington State University in Pullman at the nuclear reactor there, and it shows two students chatting. The bulk of that work would be shouldered in the post-war years by the nation's colleges and universities. During the height of the Cold War from 1949 to the late 1970s, nearly 150 university programs and more than 24 reactors sprung up on campuses across the country. Munns notes, adding that their emergence, quote, represents one of the key legacies of the Manhattan Project, unquote. Those programs taught the advanced technical skills and knowledge needed to supply the new experts of the post-war era, to be sure. Munns writes, undergirding the multiple infrastructures of weapons, power plants, and radioisotopes were legions of trained nuclear engineers, scientists, technologists, and technicians, end quote. But the programs did much more than simply train a vast new labor pool, Munns contends. They instilled the values and habits of mind of the new atomic age. In learning, quote, how to operate the complex economic, social, and military infrastructure of the state that always threatened to run out of control, end quote, what students gained from their education and experience above all, he writes perceptively, was the knowledge and assurance that they could administer their modernist state. So I'll pass it back to you, Steve, to talk about your grandfather.
Great, yeah, I want to wrap up things by just talking a little bit about some of the personal connections I have to Hanford. My grandfather worked as a steam fitter at Hanford during the Cold War. By that point, 9 nuclear reactors had been built along the banks of the Columbia River. This photograph shows several of them. There's a large reactor facility complex in the foreground of the photograph, and some of the older, including the World War II reactors, are shown in the background. They huddle right next to the Columbia River because that's where the water would come from to be able to cool the reactors. My grandfather, when he worked at Hanford, like all other employees, signed an agreement that he would not tell anyone else what it was that he did at Hanford. There was an incredible amount of secrecy that surrounded the site. As you can see in the next slide, the workers were constantly reminded. This shows a billboard sitting in the middle of the Hanford facility. The major words on it are silence means security. You can see a worker there in the foreground, and there's his family peering through the window pane of their house. And just as a reminder, the worker is being told protection for all, don't talk. In other words, you weren't even able to tell your family what it was that you did at Hanford. And that was certainly the case with my grandfather. We had absolutely no idea what it was that he was doing while he was on the site. It's possible that he worked at the reactors, but you know, there's another possibility, which is that he worked on another major facility at the Hanford site. As you see on the next slide, to generate plutonium from nuclear reactors, you need to use gigantic chemical processing plants. These were called canyon buildings, or Queen Marys by the workers, because they were the size of ocean liners. And essentially, these buildings would take the fuel rods from the reactors and submit them in a chemical process, and a tiny little dribble of plutonium would come out of the end of one of these buildings. But in the process, it generated huge amounts of extremely toxic and radioactive chemicals. At the time, in the 1950s and 1960s, the operators of Hanford and the federal government didn't really know what to do with these chemicals. So what they did is they built 177 of these gigantic tanks. This slide shows 12 of those tanks, each of them about the size of an auditorium. You can see the trucks on the side of the tanks looking like toys from this aerial perspective. And they would just pump these radioactive and toxic chemicals into these tanks, figuring that future generations would figure out what to do with all of these materials that were being generated. Well, those future generations have arrived. As you'll see on the next slide, this is what that area looks like today. Gigantic facilities have been built to try to take those radioactive and toxic chemicals out of those tanks, immobilize them in glass, and store them in a ways that they'll be less dangerous than in their current form sitting in those tanks. Those tanks were built beginning in the Cold War. They had design lifetimes of about 20 years. And those chemicals essentially are only now starting to be processed 75 years, more than 75 years after the first of them were being generated. And this cleanup process at Hanford is going to take, it's estimated, decades to conclude and cost hundreds of billions of dollars, far more than was invested in building and operating Hanford in the first place. I'll close real quickly by pointing out on the next slide where some of the plutonium from Hanford resides. This is an aerial photograph of Naval Base Kitsap, which is about 20 miles northwest of Seattle on the Kitsap Peninsula. Naval Base Kitsap is the west coast base of our Ohio-based Ohio-class nuclear submarines. This is a photograph that shows the facility where the submarines tie up, and then the fields in the background where the nuclear weapons are stored that go onto these submarines. Each of the 12 submarines at this facility carries 24 Trident II missiles, and each of those missiles carries an average of 4 nuclear warheads that can be independently targeted at Russian cities. Each of those warheads contains a pit, what's called a pit. It's about the size of your fist of plutonium that was generated at Hanford and at some similar facilities in South Carolina. So if you look at the next slide, it shows one of our submarines cruising through Hood Canal with the Olympic Mountains in the background. A single one of these submarines can destroy almost all major Russian cities. Similarly, a single Russian submarine could destroy almost every American city of any size. Basically, these signal submarines can cause the end of the world. So the very final slide shows the cover of my book. I called my book The Apocalypse Factory. It's not because of Hanford being necessarily such an apocalyptic place. We can actually clean up the contaminants that are in those tanks. It's going to take a long time and it's going to take a long money, but if we have the willpower and the political fortitude to do it, we'll get it done. The reason I called my book The Apocalypse Factory is because Hanford has created the materials that could be used to bring about the end of the world. Armageddon, the battle at the end of the world. That's the battle that is foretold in the Bible by the prophecy of the apocalypse. So what I was hoping is that by learning a little bit more about Hanford through my book and through efforts like the Hanford History Project that Mike's leading, that maybe people could take some steps of their own to make the end of the world less likely. So that's what I have to say. It looks like we do have some time for questions, fortunately, so I hope we've gotten some.
We have, happily. Okay. Thank you very much. That was fascinating. It still kind of gives me the chills and reminds me of the actual Cold War when you see those Trident submarines. You know, I remember growing up in that. So we do have some great questions. One of the first is, I think Mike probably knows the answer to this one, but for both of you, what was the breakdown of the nationalities or ethnicities of the workers at Hanford?
I can take a crack at that, and then Steve can correct me if I'm wrong. So it's quite an interesting story. DuPont estimated that DuPont was concerned about racial tensions at the site. So the site was segregated not only by gender, but also by race. The sports teams were segregated often either by what job you did or what class of job you did, or by race. There was a black swimming hole and a white swimming hole. DuPont's estimation was that about 10% of the workforce could be allocated to African-American workers without creating tension. So at any given time, there were roughly 5,000 African-American workers, assuming 50,000 people working on site. There were, give or take, about 5,000 African-Americans working at Hanford. So that, Steve, I'll throw it over to you. But that's
I mean, at that time, Hanford was the 4th largest city. The Hanford construction camp was the 4th largest city in Washington State after Seattle, Tacoma, and Spokane. So it was a sizable population of African-American workers who were there compared to many of the other places in the States. Oddly enough, very few Hispanics worked at Hanford during the Manhattan Project until the very end. as you mentioned, Mike, in your talk, one of the big problems with building Hanford was just getting the manpower to be able to do it, because so many people were off fighting. They would take almost anybody. Originally, they were going to try to do it almost entirely with white workers, realized that was going to be impossible, and it was the pressure of getting the facility built as quickly as possible, more than anything else, that led them to follow the laws that existed at that time and hire Black and Hispanic workers.
Do you know by chance, were there any rules about if people had to be native born, or could immigrants work at the facility? Were they concerned at all about where people were from if they were working at the site?
I don't know the answer to that, Mike. Do you know what were the security clearances that were required? My grandfather underwent one, but I can't imagine it was as rigorous as some.
I don't know the answer, but as Steve was saying, they were pretty desperate for it. Another one of the big problems was not just finding enough bodies, but keeping them here. The turnover was tremendous. There's very famous story about the termination winds. People would show up, they'd get off the train in Pasco. Some of them would take one look around and get right on the next train. And then, some of them showed up for work, and the winds would start blowing, or they'd be out there in the middle of winter and the freezing cold weather and the dust. And, it wasn't for the faint of heart. So I know that the recruiting effort was monumental, but I don't know the answer to that specific question about.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about they'd be doing construction in that climate. That would be brutal.
Yeah, they went through a huge number of workers at Hanford. The maximum size of the camp was 50,000 people. I think more than 150,000 were hired during the course of World War II, which is one of the reasons why so many people in Washington State have some connection to Hanford. It's amazing to me when I go around the state how many people say, "Oh yeah, I had a relative who worked there at one point."
Yeah, that's interesting. And so the next question is the Japanese American family, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name that you discussed.
The Yamuchis.
Yamuchi. Yeah, were they able to return to the area after the war, and were they able to keep their land in business?
Yes, and sort of. They did return, but at least during the war, one of their businesses, the daughter continued to run one of the businesses and was denied a renewal of the business license. In the end, the family came back and sort of prospered, and the children and the grandchildren are the ones who have told us these stories. And but during the time of the war, it was part of what's fascinating about the story of the Yamuchi family is that certain kind of randomness to who was sent away and who wasn't, and where they went, and the family, the division of the family, some being sent to the west side of the states, the Yamuchi parents going to Arkansas, the son going to Wyoming. It was, another son, and because he was an American citizen and lived in Franklin County, wasn't sent anywhere. We tend to think of ourselves as, the Tri-Cities here. The river doesn't mean a lot, but the river meant everything as far as whether you would be interned or not.
Yeah, the details of the incarceration, just as a big idea, it's pretty horrifying, but then you look into the details and it's even more destructive to family and relationships and place. Okay. The next one I have is, I have heard that, among other things, there are entire radioactive railroad cars, an ambulance, and a number of other large objects buried out on the site. Is that true?
Oh, it's true. There's plenty of railroad cars that are buried in the site. They're in a gigantic tunnel whose roof collapsed several years ago, and people were very concerned about the release of radioactivity. Yes, during the Cold War and during the Manhattan Project, there were large numbers of contaminated materials that were generated In some cases, they were disposed of semi-properly, and in other cases, they were just kind of dumped in big holes out there in the middle of the desert. And one of the tricks has been finding where all that stuff is buried since then. As part of the cleanup, the Department of Energy has made good progress, I think, in trying to identify some of those old, highly substandard waste sites and digging that material back up and putting it in a large sanitary landfill in the center of the Hanford site that is supposed to keep that material isolated from the environment. It's just a gigantic facility because there's so much material that needs to be put there. Yes, there is plenty of radioactive contaminants around there. I'd say that people probably worry as much. Well, they worry a lot more about those wastes that are sitting in those gigantic tanks, because those are the ones that have the potential to leak and to put large quantities of radioactive materials into the groundwater, and then those materials could flow into the Columbia River and flow to communities downstream from there. But yes, there's still plenty of cleanup work to do, while at the same time, I do have to acknowledge the efforts the Department of Energy has made have really had they've had some really positive benefits in terms of cleaning up some of those old sites.
The scale of it is so enormous. It's hard to fathom. Let's see, can Steve speak about the extent of the plutonium storage area on Kitsap Peninsula?
Yeah, no, not really. I mean, I know they're there. That's where our nuclear weapons are stored before being put on the submarines as the submarines are deployed. There are groups that protest outside Naval Base Kitsap on a regular basis. They would know slightly more about that, but no, that's top secret information. The amount of plutonium that's in pits today, and even the size and shapes of the pits that are in the core of our nuclear weapons, that is still classified information. So I really don't know too much about that.
And then despite the billboards, the don't talk for safety billboards, was there ever a problem of people talking?
What do you think, Mike? You live there in the Tri-Cities. My grandfather never talked, but I don't know. And he was quite a storyteller, so we worked for him.
I don't know. I can't vouch for where the truth of these stories, ends and the apocryphal begins, but there are, in fact, many stories of spies. They were, labor spies who sent to taverns and bars and, to listen to see if workers were talking to each other about what they were doing. And if you were discovered to be talking about your work outside of work, you were summarily dismissed. You were fired. So, I have to think, we have hundreds in our Hanford collection. We have hundreds and hundreds of signs reiterating the importance of not talking, of the danger of loose lips. We have hand-painted signs that show Hitler peeking around buildings. He's listening. So, if you measure the degree of anxiety, and if you want to just assume that there had to be some, where there was all that smoke, I assume that some people did talk, but I don't think they talked and stayed around very long.
I might say we do know that some people were talking, because immediately after World War II, the Soviets were appalled that the United States had been able to build a nuclear weapon, and Stalin decided that he needed to build a nuclear weapon as quickly as possible to re-achieve parity with the United States. And essentially, the fastest way for them to build a nuclear weapon was to do exactly what had been done at Hanford. And they essentially recreated many aspects of the Hanford site at their own nuclear site, 1,000 miles east of Moscow. And in some cases, built reactors that were so close to the reactors built at Hanford that it seems obvious that they had purloined blueprints of Hanford reactors and were working off those designs. And when the Soviets exploded their first bomb in 1949, it was essentially a replica of the bombs that had been built using the plutonium made from Hanford.
Steve, can I just ask a quick question? I have heard that there were, Russian spies infiltrating the Hanford site. Has that ever been proven, or is there any historical record of who those people were, or is it just speculation that there had to be somebody because of what you just said?
Yeah, there's the information is still spotty and fragmentary, but there clearly was a spy at Hanford. Some of this still comes out as Soviet archives are being released, and we know more about the kinds of information that they were getting out of Hanford. But yes, there was at least one person at Hanford that's pretty well known who was supplying information to the Soviets, and probably more.
So we've answered all of the open questions. I don't think I missed any in the chat, but I just have one more for you before we sign off, or have Rachel come back on, is what do both of you think are is the benefit of having the B reactor preserved and available for people to tour? Other than just that it's very cool and fascinating, but as historians and people who want to share these stories, what do you see the value of having the actual facility in addition to the archives?
Take that first, Steve.
Yeah, I think it's just an absolutely incredible place. It's one of the landmarks of the 20th century, really. It's shocking to me that the consideration was ever given to tearing that reactor down. It is the very first large-scale nuclear reactor built anywhere in the world, and all nuclear reactors in the world today are essentially descended from that B reactor. I mean, the first time I walked into that place, I just couldn't believe it. It just took my breath away that this facility still existed, that the very first nuclear reactor that was ever been built. I mean, Fermi's reactor under the football stands in Chicago was taken down within a couple of months. So the fact that the B reactor is there, that people can go see it and can go learn about this history and learn about the ways in which this history continues to affect us today, because the world could end within the next 24 hours if things went wrong because of the materials created at Hanford and at other facilities around the world. I mean, it's just an invaluable resource. Mike is involved in efforts to get more people into the B reactor, and I just think it's a wonderful idea because there's so much to learn at that place.
Yeah, I would just add that, I'm thrilled that the National Park Service is involved, that the B reactor has become a centerpiece for the Manhattan Project National Historical Park, which is unique in that it is at 3 separate locations, at Oak Ridge, at Los Alamos, and at Hanford. Hanford has far and away the most accessible, the best preserved, in B reactor, the best monuments of the entire park. What is great about having the Park Service involved is that they are very committed to telling the whole story of the Manhattan Project. I think far too often we tend to focus on one side of the story or the other side. Either, we tend to focus on the devastation of the bombs and the tragedy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and certainly that is a very important part of the story. The act of imagination and the sort of human will that went into creating this B reactor, to have envisioned it, imagined it, and to literally to have built it, from planning off the back of envelopes and napkins, it's just the cause for, it's a real testament to human ingenuity and willpower. And so I think that's one of the things that's really important about this, is it becomes a location for reflecting on the whole story. The people who, it isn't a black and white story. It's a very complicated story, and it encourages us to reflect upon our own history, for sure, but but about history in general, and about the unforeseen consequences that come about when people have to make decisions in the midst of historical crises. And I just think that having this national park here, it presents opportunities for us to have, difficult but necessary conversations about history and our engagement with it and so forth. And I would just like to add one other thing to what Steve said. There are cleanup tours. I don't know, they're not as easy to get as the park tours, but if you ever have a chance, the cleanup story, as Steve says, is truly remarkable. I mean, what they are undertaking out there is almost as miraculous and astonishing as the Manhattan Project itself. It's at least as it's similar in that it is. These people are having to figure out how to do something that no one had ever anticipated having to do, and so I think this is the last thing I'll say. I think part of what is so impressive to me about B-Reactor in the way that it speaks to the ability for people to come together and get some massive project done in this incredible amount of time. It's sort of an inspiration and a testament to our ability, to humans' abilities to be able to tackle challenges of all kinds. And if for no other reason, I think that's a really important reason why it's still there, should be there, needs to be there.
Thank you. It's fascinating. Thank you to you both for the program tonight. This has been lovely. I'll refer people to the question and answer. There was one question we didn't get to, but I put in a couple sources that might be helpful to delve further into that topic. It was about the Kennewick being a sundown town and the racial segregation policies that were pretty deeply entrenched in the communities. And so I put in some possible ideas, the books that we saw tonight, and then a couple others. So I'll send you there, and I'll pass it back over to Rachel to tell us what is next on the agenda.
Well, first, I just want to give a huge thank you both to you, Michael and Steve, and to you, Jennifer, for all the knowledge that was shared tonight. I know I have a reading list now of books I'm going to have to check out. So I really appreciate it, especially the closing thoughts of how much we can learn from this history, and it makes me want to go be in the presence of the reactor and really think about that power, and what can we learn from projects like that. So thank you. As Jennifer was mentioning, I am here to give a shout out for next month. But before I go into that, I almost forgot, but I did not. We will be asking for your feedback. We'd love to know what you thought. So please take a look at the survey, which is going to be dropped into the chat, and we will also send that out over email after the program. We are always looking to improve and know what you think, so please take a moment to look at that. And then next month, we're going to be looking at the important connections between health and homelessness with Josephine Ensign. So please come. It's going to be third Wednesday, as always, on March 17th, 6:30. You will find us here online, and we will put the link to that in the chat as well. And then finally, if you learned something new or enjoy the work we're doing during this continuing to be an unprecedented time in history, please consider making a gift or becoming a MOHAI member to support future programs and help sustain the museum beyond this closure. We really appreciate that, and just please come back. We always love having you here, and we're gonna keep looking forward to seeing you in person. And until then, wishing all of you that you stay safe, stay healthy, and have a lovely rest of your evening. So signing off, be well, and have a good night.
Thanks so much, Rachel.
Yeah, thank you.